Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this Investor Alliance webinar on the 2019 findings of the Corporate Human Rights Benchmark. As many of you will know, the Corporate Human Rights Benchmark, or the CHRB for short, was launched last week. And this year, the benchmark is looking at companies across 4 sectors: agricultural products, apparel, extractives, and ICT manufacturing. So we are extremely excited to be with you today and to have both Dan Neal, the CHRB Program Director, as well as Bennett Freeman, the CHRB co-founder, as well as Senior Advisor and former SVP of Sustainability and Research and Policy at Calvert Investments. So we're excited to have them with us today to really talk about the latest findings in the CHRB and also how investors can use this in their work. This is especially important, as I'm sure many of you will know, for the work of the Investor Alliance, since ultimately the CHRB is a key tool that we use and that we encourage our members to use to help guide their efforts really to fulfill their own human rights responsibilities by integrating human rights criteria throughout the investment life cycle, and specifically include an analysis of corporate conduct on human rights at the point of investment decision making, as well as into their corporate engagement. So this is indeed a very timely and welcome event for us. So before we hand over to Dan, who will get us started today, I just want to highlight a few logistical points. The first is that we are recording this webinar, so that will be available to you all after the webinar. The second is that you are all muted at this time, but you will have 2 opportunities or 2 ways in which you could ask questions. One is for you to raise your hand, virtually raise your hand on the right side of the screen, and then once we open up for questions and comments later on, we will unmute you. And then the second option, of course, is to type your question into the comment box, also on the right-hand side, and then I will read that out once we start the discussion. So I will leave it there. Just again, thank you all for joining us, and then Dan, over to you.
Brilliant. So everyone hear me? Good, great. Thanks very much. It was a bit of a shock to know I was going to be on video, but thankfully the office isn't too bad here. We launched on Friday, so this is quite fresh, to be honest. We had a big build up to it, and the results have only just come out, so don't worry if you haven't seen any of it so far. I'm going to run through, just remind us all of what CHRB looks at, and then look at the overall results, have a quick discussion on particularly the tech sector, rather than going into each and every individual sector, and then do something new, which I haven't looked at yet, which is a breakout of some of the more US focused and how we can look at the data and how people can start to use it going forward. Bennett is then going to come in on some of the more relevance for investors, and then hopefully we can have a good session on question and answer towards the end. Okay, just hopefully going to progress a slide. There we go. So as Paloma said, we have 4 sectors that we focus on: the apparel, agricultural products, extractives, and tech manufacture, which we added this year. And we look at companies across 6 themes. So from governance and policies to due diligence, remedies and grievance mechanisms. Themes A, B, and C are effectively your risk management framework, if you like, as a corporate. Themes D and E are really focused on performance, and it's already underpinned by transparency, and we focus on publicly available data. Sorry, we lost a little bit off the bottom there. We're in our 3rd cycle this year, and we've added 100 new companies. So we doubled the size, and so there were 60 new companies in the 3 sectors and 40 in ICT. And we mirrored the companies from Know the Chain when looking at the tech manufacturing companies. We engage, we say meaningfully engaged. We engage about 2/3 of the companies so far, which is pretty good considering half of them were brand new. And all of the companies we look at are listed. Each company is assessed on roughly 50 indicators, but some companies are crossed over in multiple themes. So Amazon, for instance, crosses over 3 themes and therefore has like the most indicators that it's ranked against. The methodology is very much grounded in the UN Guiding Principles on Business Human Rights, and each indicator has a level within it of different points of 0, half, 1, 1.5, 2, etc. It's good to understand as well that CHRB has a very limited scope. We look in detail, but it is at the operations and supply chain, not downstream collective impacts, etc. So that's always worth bearing in mind. Okay, hopefully I've still got control. So this is the big picture. The average score for all 200 companies is 24% this year. We can see that actually the majority of companies are scoring less than 20%, and there is a tail that heads out towards the 80 to 90 bracket. So while there's a certain number of companies that are scoring above 40 and 50%, they are in the minority, but they do show that this is actually possible. When we look at that across the theme scores, we can see that it isn't that just companies have a really good policy and they've got nothing in place. We're seeing a mix across all of the themes, and I think it's safe to say that some companies are doing things across the whole of it, and others are just consistently scoring badly across the whole of it. So it's kind of 6 of one and half a dozen of the other, depending on which way you want to look at it. But as I'll come on to some of the other ones later on, there's a long way to go before we're even at half marks. In terms of key weaknesses, almost half of all of the global companies, so 49%, I was annoyed the numbers didn't quite work, but 49% of companies scored 0 on all 5 of our human rights due diligence indicators. So not a single half point across any of the 5 indicators that we have, which is quite indicative. 1 in 5 companies scores 0 on a commitment to respect human rights. The first thing in the UNGPs that we'd expect to see, and those companies on average score less than 10%. Very few companies at the other end are disclosing board linked remuneration. So basically where board members have human rights policy achievements linked to their remuneration. But those that do average about 60%, which shows the kind of the more progressive company scoring. We are seeing supply chain mapping as an example of a specific risk or enabling factor increasing year on year, but it's still only a minority of companies that are doing that, and they tend to be quite progressive. And we're definitely seeing low scores related to specific risks for human rights, whether it's bonded labour, land rights, and child labour, with a different focus depending on each sector. The tech sector, which is the one I'm going to focus on in a bit more detail, does score significantly lower than the other sectors, but it should be reminded that this is their first ranking, so they haven't been included 3 times previously. Okay, just pulling out the tech manufacturing sector. The other 3 sectors, I have these similar slides, but I've hidden them all just for the sake of time. This is how the tech sector looks in its first iteration. So it's good actually to see, because we're setting the bar quite low here, but it's good to see that 0 to 10% isn't the most populated banding, which it was for the other companies the first time they were included. So that's positive to see. On the downside, we see that actually no company scored above 50%, whereas several companies were doing better than this in 2017 with the first sector. I think quite a few of the tech sector companies sort of knew this was coming, but maybe thought they were going to be scoring a little higher. We've seen some kind of pushback from some of the companies so far as to the level of their scoring. But I think when you see how it compared to the 24% overall, it's relatively a fair reflection of the sector as a whole. This is how it's broken out. You can see the theme scores there on the left, and the average score is 18%. I would like to say that of the 100 new companies that we added, the average score was 16%. Oh, sorry, 17%. So the tech sector is actually doing slightly better than some of the other new companies that have come in this year, but it is broadly reflective of new companies, and it's really exactly where the other companies were back in 2017. Okay, so this ties into some of the theory of change stuff around benchmarking, but it's just good to know that if I look at the extractive sector scoring 29% on average, we know that there's partly to do with the fact they've had 3 years worth of pressure to improve. The table on the right hand side shows the bandings. As you can see, there's only a few companies up at the very top, Hewlett Packard, Microsoft, HP in the top 3. Of the top 6 companies in Know the Chain, 5 of them are in our top 6. There's a very, very good crossover between us, particularly in taking it in terms of quartiles. You'll recognize quite a few of the lower scoring companies, and I say that those under 20%, Foxconn, Amazon, Nintendo, Hitachi, and then obviously some of the ones very, on the lowest scoring companies, we don't necessarily recognize those names straight away, but they tend to be in most of the products that we might have on our person or dotted around the house. We've got some additional information in there this year. You won't see a score change because it's their first year, but the other sectors have that data. The flag indicates that we've assessed them against a serious allegation of human rights impacts. So we looked at, I'll come on to that in a bit more detail later, but what we find is actually it tends to be the better scoring companies and the bigger well-known brands that have the allegations raised against them that we can identify, whereas some of the lower scoring ones also tend to be more frequently in jurisdictions where there's less freedom of expression, and we find less of the stories as well. The X that you see there indicates that the company has not engaged with us in any kind of meaningful way, or with the investor coalition that we will go forward in the future with other companies. So I think actually, because of Know the Chain, we had a really good engagement level with the ICT companies, but it's interesting to see obviously that the lower scoring companies tend to be the ones that aren't engaged. The exclamation mark means that they've scored 0 on human rights due diligence, which is a nice quick way of pulling out, okay, if you had to look at one company, what they're doing, have they got anything on due diligence or not that we give points for. So that's how they're shaping up there. Without dwelling too much on the ICT sector, I wanted to talk about the benchmarking process and what progress we've seen since 2017. So these are the original 100 companies across the 3 sectors, excluding ICT manufacture. As you can see in the first year, there's an overwhelming preponderance of companies in the lowest bands, and there's a distribution which is like a ski ramp, it just goes straight up from the top and winds down. Last year, we actually saw a nice level of movement with companies coming out of the lowest bands and starting to trickle up towards the highest bands. And this year, that's been reflected again. So the 0 to 10% has gone from being the most largest number of companies in there to being the 3rd largest. And we're going from a kind of ski ramp distribution to a sort of whale-shaped teardrop distribution, with more and more companies scoring above 40 to 50%. So this is a really kind of strong validation for us that we are seeing movement, and that's really positive. And when we look at the average scores, we see that over time they are moving in the right direction, which is a positive thing to see. But we have to put that in context of, the highest companies are in the 80 to 90% band, and the average score is down around 31%. We're a very long way from having some sort of normal-ish distribution around 50 to 60%, which might indicate that the majority of companies are doing the very basic things that are expected of them under the UN guiding principles. I'll just build up to the next slide. That pattern in terms of improvement of scores is reflected across all of the themes. So we know that companies are trying to do work, not just in new policies and not just in new processes, but also in the implementation of things. So there's a broad range of maturity of companies, and people are working on them in different aspects. The problem with extrapolation from averages is knowing whether that's going to continue. And we've only had 3 years to look at this increase. At what point in the future do we think the average score would be 50%? At what point do we think in the future the average score would be 85%? And it's very hard to tell, actually, because quite a few companies really aren't going anywhere. Now, this rather crude graphic of the blue line shows the scores in 2017 versus 2019. Anyone off the line has changed their score. But realistically, we made some tweaks to the methodology. And so anyone within this red bracket has shifted less than 1%, 2% over 3.5 years' time. So what we see is that there's quite a concentration of companies that are either not moving anywhere and they're effectively static, or they're improving a little bit, but they're still scoring under 20%. And those ones are really an issue for, I think, us and the limitations of benchmarking. Because although 3/4 are improving, and that's really good, 20% are static and are low scoring. And those static companies act as a drag on the whole sector. So while the average score is going up, the good, in inverted commas, companies have to do more and more to drag the average along. And these ones are obviously not being motivated to move as yet. So that's something that we want to bear in mind as we go forward. One of the things we look at, and this is just to bring it back to everyone on human rights, is allegations of abuse. We've got a lot more data in the report, which I'll talk about shortly, but this is just how it's split out, as you see, as some of the key risks that we focus on. We look at, in detail, almost 150 allegations, and the key thing I'd like you to take away is that only 3% of those were seen to be remedied to the satisfaction of victims. But as I mentioned on the table, higher scoring companies are far likelier to have serious allegations raised against them. So just because companies do have the allegation doesn't necessarily equate in the same way to say they are bad. I think it's worth noting that there are plenty of companies in the lower scoring bands who we think there is more happening, but maybe their supply chain is not as clear and there isn't the attention given to them when it comes to human rights abuse allegations. Just as a US focus, this map is in the center of our report, and obviously all the companies on the left are North America, which actually includes some Canadian and Mexican companies. But there's 72 US companies, 39 of which are repeat, and they averaged 23% compared to a 37% in Europe. They reflect the wider trend, though, that 50% of them score 0 on all 5 human rights due diligence indicators, which gives a nice clear-cut number of companies to look at. And across the other 4 sectors, ICT is reflecting that trend of still being the lowest scoring. When we look at the companies in detail, all these ones here highlighted in red are scoring less than 10%, although I will health check Philips 66 because they're scoring 9.9%, and I checked that before he came on. Of repeat companies scoring less than 10% in total, these ones here, Philips, Costco, Monster Beverages, Starbucks, Ross Stores, EOG Resources, they've been in 2, perhaps 3 years and are still scoring less than 10% and not really moving. Whereas companies such as Kraft Heinz, Macy's, some of the other ones that have been given considerable media and investor pressure have started moving out of the lowest bands. And I think we'll see some more of that going forward. If any of you saw our launch coverage in the FT, Amazon was listed on there. Now, interestingly, Amazon got their scores on Tuesday. They launched their new human rights policy and disclosed that publicly on Wednesday, and then had something ready to talk to the FT on Thursday. There are elements of coincidence and timing, but it's good to see that some things are happening regardless of who's responsible for making it happen. See Bennett smiling in there. In terms of data, so we've got data, please use it. Online, there is an overarching key findings doc. It's quite short, it's only 24 pages or so. We will be doing sector-specific reports shortly. They should all be about 65 pages per sector, and they'll be able to drill into more of the detail about the differences between extractives, tech manufacturer, when we look at the thematic analysis and the indicator analysis. But online, what we have is all of the data in one spreadsheet. So it's got 23 tabs. It's got as much detail as you'd like to go into across all of the companies. So if you want to filter for US-based companies, it's got all their ISINs. You can go through and see how they do on their theme scores. You can see how they compare over time. All of that data is in there, and it's all freely available. When you look at each company, I said you can start comparing them on their theme scores, and it is quite nice to be able to pull out and see how they compare to each other. So just looking at Walmart, for instance, on 22 versus Marks and Spencer's as a similar company on 72%. And start seeing where they're comparing in terms of their indicators and their theme scores. I think the companies at the top, they start to be differentiated on how they're doing on their performance indicators. But the companies in the lower bands are really still just talking about policies and embedding human rights due diligence into their processes. Just for reference, there's Adidas, the highest scoring company in the rankings so far. Interesting that it scores full marks on its remedies and grievance mechanisms. it also scores 4 marks on human rights due diligence. And I think there's a clear correlation between those who are doing well on due diligence and those who are doing well overall. If you do start to use the information and data, each company has its own scorecard, which this is the Amazon example. It's depending on the company, they can be 10, 20 pages long, depending on the amount of detail and data that's in there. All of these are downloadable from the website, and in each one it should have the links to all of the publicly available information that goes with it. What I would encourage people to do is, one, if they want to know more, actually contact us and we can talk through some of it. But two is to understand that the scorecard is a snapshot that reflects all the research that went into to the company beforehand, and it needs to be looked at sometimes alongside the methodology, which is also available online and downloadable. The methodology, just to show you one of the indicators here, looking at the commitment to respect human rights, the one that I said 1 in 5 companies are scoring 0 on. When you have that in your head and then you look at the scorecard here, which is the first part of it, this is for Amazon actually, and there just wasn't much information there. So what you find when we say not met, there just wasn't the level of data there for us to make an assessment on them, and they definitely didn't come up with the new human rights commitments. But it's sometimes, when we look at just the policy commitments, that's the only bit of detail you have there, commitment to respect human rights, whereas actually it's all of the text in the methodology, and it's sometimes better to refer to that to understand what we're asking for. Similarly, this is just one to show on one of the indicators of 5 on due diligence. That's the level of detail that we go into in asking the question, and this shows just what the score 1 research was for that single indicator for Amazon, which shows you, for instance, in this case, they had lots of stuff on modern slavery, but not necessarily on broad human rights due diligence. And I think this reflects a problem with the tech manufacturing sector as a whole, that they've been playing kind of chasing regulation, whether it's California supply chain or EU conflict minerals or the GDPR, whatever's coming out, and they're not doing something holistically. But with all of this, you should be able to then click on the link and find, if they haven't changed it already, what the source reference was for the information and how we assess them on their disclosures. So just some final conclusions before handing on to Bennett. If we could take away that half of companies score 0 on all those human rights due diligence indicators, I think some of you here will be signed on to the call for mandatory human rights due diligence with Investor Alliance. This is great evidence that there is a real issue here. Secondly, 3/4 of companies are moving in the right direction, but 1/5 are static. This is a call out to say that actually there are companies that will move. We know, for instance, Kraft Heinz refused to engage with us. They didn't engage after the Financial Times did a front page in the FTFM. They finally engaged, and it just happened to be after that shareholder resolution was put out in the ICCR document. So I think those companies down the bottom there can definitely be motivated to move with pressure from investors such as yourselves. And lastly, scrutiny works, but companies. Sorry, that's my time's up. Scrutiny works, but companies have to be in the race. And I think it's just a broader one for understanding benchmarking, that, yeah, if companies are interested and they're being motivated to move by external pressure, then this will work and we can get them to improve. But they have to both be assessed and be in a benchmark, and they have to have the pressure on them as well at the same time. Great, that's my 21 minutes. I think, Bennett, you should go on to your slide.
Good.
Have you taken it back?
Yeah, great. Thank you, Dan, and thank you, Paloma, and delighted to present just 2 slides here and then join Dan for the questions and answers. I'm just going back to the launch of CHRB. We conceived this initiative back in mid to late 2014, and I can say as a co-founder that after companies themselves, that investors have been the single most important target audience and constituency for CHRB from the get-go. And we have seen from the outset, and really from the development of our methodology and the launch of our first pilot rankings in March of 2017, our second round in November of 2018, and now this third round here in November of 2019, two fundamental purposes that we hope investors will see in what we do. First is to inform investment research and due diligence, and in turn, investment decisions and outcomes across portfolios. We're talking largely among asset classes, public equities, but there is some spillover into other asset classes as well. But we view both our criteria and our company-specific results as really useful, we hope really useful qualitative criteria, and then specific findings for investors to inform that research and due diligence. The second purpose for investors is in turn then using the criteria and the results to inform company engagement, whether it's through direct dialogue with the IR function or other corporate functions, and shareholder advocacy. And of course, shareholder advocacy is a more widespread phenomenon given access to proxies for US shareholders. But we have seen more use of CHRB for company engagement and shareholder advocacy, and really the ideal is in advocacy, engagement and advocacy with specific companies is to draw on our very specific results. These two purposes, informing investment research and informing company engagement and advocacy, are complementary and mutually reinforcing. And we hope that year by year that the engagement by investors, the use of this data by investors, will help contribute to higher scores for companies. And of course, the core objective that links these two purposes is highlighting and in turn diminishing, we hope, human rights related risk for companies and investors alike. I would note that the two other principal human rights benchmarking initiatives that have both emerged as we have over the last half dozen years, namely Know the Chain and Ranking Digital Rights, both view investors as primary constituencies along with companies, and both really view investors as encourage investors to use their criteria and their results for the same exact two purposes of informing research and due diligence, as well as engagement and advocacy. Let's just turn now to the next slide. These are just a few suggestions, I think pretty obvious ones, coming off our findings as to some of the specific points that investors might want to raise generically with certain companies, and of course then raise their specific results with them. First and foremost is due diligence. Dan has highlighted the really poor scores across the board. I mean, there's some who do well on human rights due diligence, but half the companies that we've looked at this year, as you saw highlighted, failed entirely across the board. So it seems to us that the single most important area of focus that investors can probably find useful is highlighting deficiencies in human rights due diligence. And that's not just for companies that are failing across the board, the bottom half, but also the top half, who, with a few exceptions, are incomplete. So we would encourage investors to take a look at those elements laid out in the UN Guiding Principles on due diligence, and encourage companies, for example, if they're not employing human rights impact assessments, to do so in certain circumstances. A second area of focus that is particularly useful, we would think, for U.S. Investors, or at least those dealing with U.S. companies, is around governance, board level governance and oversight of human rights related risk. And board governance of human rights is notably weaker for US companies than it is for those based in the UK and elsewhere in Europe. There are a few exceptions, of course, both of weak governance with UK and European companies and relatively strong governance on the part of US companies. But this is there's a clear transatlantic disconnect here. And we hope that investors can highlight the need for board level governance. Board remuneration tied to human rights policy and due diligence, I think, would be the ultimate indicator that we would want to see from companies, the ultimate level of commitment. But most companies, US companies, aren't even doing the basics at the board level of having regular reviews, periodic reviews of human rights commitment and due diligence, and few, if any, companies have people with human rights or labor rights backgrounds on their boards. Another area of focus, of course, would be ICT manufacturing, and we've pointed out here that the scores have come in notably lower, although, as Dan noted, they're at about the level on average that they were the first time around for our other three sectors, going back to March of 2017. Dan also noted that the tech companies appear to be driven by specific regulatory requirements, whether it's Dodd-Frank 1502 on conflict minerals, or the California Supply Chain Transparency Act, or UK Modern Slavery Act, and so forth. But it's also worth noting that some of these tech companies have been working on labor and human rights in their supply chains for 2 decades or longer, and still are not at the level of peer companies in other sectors. So we would encourage investors to take a particularly close look at tech companies. So let me just conclude by noting that from an investor perspective, we hope that first and foremost, the individual company scores, an analysis of those scores that you can find through our web portal will be of direct use to companies. But we also hope that, to investors. We also hope that investors, though, will examine and use the comparisons that we lay out among companies within sectors, and ask questions as to which companies are doing less well than others and why that might be, and raising some of those comparative contrasts with companies that you hold in your portfolios. And also, in addition to the sectoral comparisons, cross-sectoral comparisons can be useful as well among peer companies. And I think that there are some learnings that can be discerned across sectors of relative areas of strength and weakness. And while principally it's more important to analyze the intra-sector comparisons, companies to companies in the same sectors, it also, I think, can be useful both for companies as a benchmarking tool and for investors as a due diligence frame to look at comparisons across sectors too. So let me end with that, and we'll move on in shortly here to answering your questions.
Great. Thanks so much, both, for that excellent presentation, and also, Bennett, for those recommendations around what issues investors should be focusing on. We already have quite a few questions, so I'm just going to maybe split them up in twos. We have 4 now. So the first question is coming from Frank Sherman, and really a question around how much the CHRB score has to do with process versus performance. So, can companies have a good sound structure but also just have poor implementation. So that's one question. And touching on one of the examples or kind of recommendations that you made there towards the end, Bennett, another question is around whether there are any examples that you all have where the board member specifically has been, or where rather board membership remuneration has been dependent on human rights or ESG metrics. So any specific examples of companies doing that. So I'll leave that to you both now. We'll go back to the rest later.
Sure. So, I mean, the process, we say the CHRB score provides a proxy for performance. And I think it's worth understanding that there is no universally agreed idea of what human rights performance looks like. Because we're grounded in the UNGPs, we are very much focused on do they have the commitments and the systems in place to avoid harm in the first place, rather than looking necessarily at a good load of positive potential impacts on human rights, because then you end up in an untenable situation of trade-offs between the positives and the negatives. Whether companies can have a good structure but poor implementation, I think absolutely they can. Having worked inside some of the companies that we benchmarked previously, the lag between governance signing off on a policy and that policy being implemented in operations and maybe large joint ventures could be 5 years if they have a really strong governance structure in place to make sure that these things are actually rolled out. So while we aim to be able to tell the difference, it can be quite tricky to do that. And one that's interesting, and we fully hold our hands up to when things do go wrong. Vale was, so the Vale Brumadinho dam disaster, they improved their score from 1 year to the next because they put in place a lot of new systems. But at the end of it, and what it looks like was that there was a significant engineering failure, which has had a huge human rights impact. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that their human rights due diligence process wasn't any good. Actually, when the investigations all come out, there's going to be a lot of stuff there about what was happening with the quality around the audits and the engineering structures. So you end up with them having quite bad human rights performance in terms of their impacts, but their systems being quite good and not necessarily able to deal with it. And that's so much, I know it doesn't necessarily answer your question that well, but the way we frame it at the moment is it's about 50%, if you like, on process and about 50% on performance. We would love, and we're doing a big methodology review next year to expand on that performance assessment. But I think at the moment, so few companies are disclosing information on performance and on outcomes that we just end up with a whole field of zeros. And the point is, it's a benchmark which is about driving performance through competition, which means you need to be able to compare and to show the differences between companies. So we're limited, I think, in what we can do in some ways. Bennett, I don't know if you want to add on that.
Well, I would just add that, policy frameworks, due diligence processes are the obvious and frankly easier starting point. And I think it's fair to observe that CHRB, along with Know the Chain and Ranking Digital Rights, have found it more challenging as an analytical proposition to really determine performance and impact. It's really a collective challenge that we face. And I'm hopeful that now with 3 rounds under our belts with this new one before you today, that our methodology review next year is going to, and along with some of the other learnings in the broader business and human rights field above and beyond benchmarking, will inform us as to sharpen our focus on performance. But it's difficult, as you know, there are some quantitative metrics that we look at that are particularly tangible with respect to supply chain labor and human rights, but the human rights field is much more qualitative than quantitative, and therefore more difficult to measure and determine performance, let alone impact. But I think we're getting closer, and we've gotten closer. We've moved in this direction the last couple of years. And while we're not going to reach perfection next year, I think that the methodology review will get us closer yet.
I think, as Bennett's saying, we are we're quite confident in the methodology as a proxy for performance. And if you compare it to something saying like, okay, you've got a financial management system, but how good is your financial performance? There's worlds apart between those two. And the same, I think, with environmental management systems. Whereas I think the way that we frame things, that the human rights scores are more of a proxy for that.
Yeah, just on the remuneration, the board level remuneration, Dan, you may have an example of two. They're very rare, but
Unilever was one, I think, off the top of my head. Unilever was one.
Unilever's one. And in fact, they tied not just CEO but senior executive compensation partly to a range of broader sustainability related factors, which is quite commendable. This is not an absolutely categorical statement I'm about to make, but I think that Coca-Cola is unusual, if not unique, among, say, Fortune 50 or at least 20 companies among US corporates for having somebody on the board who has significant, credible human rights credentials. That's Alexis Herman, is a former U.S. Secretary of Labor under President Clinton, and before that, a longtime leader in the civil rights community in the United States. I can't think of, I'm not aware of any other major company, at least in corporate America, who has somebody with that kind of a standing and perspective experience on labor and human rights issues. I hope others will follow. We're seeing some progress in this area with people with environmental sustainability and climate experience and credentials, but there's a long way to go here. But in the meantime, we at least want to see companies strengthen at the board level their oversight of human rights policy and due diligence.
Great, thanks so much. I mean, I think recently in the Investor Alliance, we hosted a strategy session in October, specifically focusing on the tech sector, and their sort of a key priority moving forward was the issue of human rights governance, board level oversight, and really trying to get at it through various different means. So this is actually a really helpful recommendation and insight, because I know that a lot of our members are really looking closely at, what is the best ask when it comes to ensuring that the board does have oversight. And this actually hasn't been one of the things that we've talked too much about. So that's very helpful. So there are a couple more questions. Have you found that companies are accepting the methodology after explanation, or are they questioning their scores? That came up in that.
I'll do that one first. There's two parts to that. So questioning the methodology, yes, especially in their first year. And then yes to questioning their scores, especially in the first year. So when this was coming out, people like John Morrison of the Institute of Human Rights Business was basically being kicked in the shins by most of his colleagues in companies, and they were quite worried about the CHRB. And it's kind of shifted now to companies saying that we've invested a lot of time and effort to align with this and to do more work in this space. So please don't go away. But new companies coming in are definitely quite questioning of it, and yeah, they don't like an approach which is an external person saying whether they're good or bad. Some unknown, rather large US tech companies take some quite, I have to say it, but quite arrogant approaches, which basically says, well, no, the world can conform to us because we are the best, and we don't care about your international standards of human rights. And, you should just allow us to do what we're doing. So we do get considerable pushback, but companies, we have an appeals process. We allow companies to appeal if they think there's egregious errors and things like that. So most companies now accept that the methodology, because it's grounded in international principles, is pretty robust.
Yeah, I would just add here that while there has been pushback, we have engaged a wide range of experts and stakeholders, especially including companies, going back to our very first convening in London in November of 2013. And in 2015, when we did our first consultation on our first cut at our criteria and methodology, I think in that calendar year, we consulted over 400 individuals in every continent other than Antarctica, obviously. And over half of those were company people, as well as people from trade associations, industry associations, and so forth. So, we have built this criteria and methodology not only on with the people who are the co-founders and the expert staff and all of their collective experience, but more importantly, through these extensive consultations. And we, just as we advocate continuous improvement on the part of companies, so too do we embrace continuous improvement ourselves. And that's reflected in the fact that our theater is dark in 2020 as we undertake a further comprehensive review of our methodology, which is the same thing that Know the Chain and Ranking Digital Rights are doing. So, all three of us, again, share this commitment to stakeholder and expert consultation, not least with companies, and to continuous refinement. I don't think you'll see, fundamental changes, but you will certainly see at least incremental ones that will reflect the feedback we've been getting and the further consultations we're going to undertake.
Great. So another question is that also from Frank. We are still getting company pushback that the supplier code plus audit is adequate, right? We require suppliers to follow local laws is the kind of common line. So how do we break that paradigm with companies is what he'd like to know.
I can put on a previous career hat as a consultant and talk about it. I'm not sure from an external ranking element. I think it would be a good one for us to take on and look at it as okay, what do we see as in terms of the performance elements that might be contradictory to those basic requirements there. I think it's broadly accepted that just relying on a supplier code of conduct, ad hoc occasional audits, and local law does not result in avoiding human rights impacts. I think no one in the field would argue against that. And that's probably something we'd have to bring in other people to kind of reinforce that message. The other thing, I mean, with the local law element, it's always very interesting because the majority of the human rights abuse allegations we have are not in the headquarters of the companies. They're in their supply chain and they're all in developing countries. And it's very easy to say, well, we follow local law. And it's like, great, so you accept that people should be executed because of their sexuality. Thank you very much. Can we have that on record? I don't necessarily suggest you take that line with the companies, but that kind of thing is kind of what they're pushing a little bit, that it's okay because it's legal. Well, there's plenty of instances when things are legal and they're definitely not okay. And so I think that just is a kind of a cop-out that I have to rein in my tongue quite a bit when I engage with companies on, because it's infuriating. And you do a lot in Kazakh cotton and all those things. What do you think?
Yeah, I would just add to Dan's observations here, and it's a great question, and we could have a whole conference, let alone a webinar, just to address Frank's good question, is that, with 2 decades and really a quarter century now, particularly of footwear and apparel, and 2 decades really of food, beverage, and agriculture, and auto, and consumer electronics, of experience dealing with supply chain labor, we still haven't nailed it. The penetration beyond tier 1 suppliers is scant, or at least spotty. But the real fundamental problem, and Dan really put his finger on it, and I'll just hit it with a hammer, is the necessity but insufficiency of corporate responsibility. Corporate responsibility through the supply chain has to be conjoined with public policy, with the responsibility of governments to enforce these laws, many of which are fine on the books, but are enforced inconsistently at best in many jurisdictions. There's a terrific piece of academic scholarship that's now 6 years old that demonstrates this point empirically by Richard Locke about the kind of trade-offs between public and private authority and responsibility. But we have a long way to go to engage governments and international institutions, and for all the terrific efforts of the ILO, too many governments are still doing an inadequate job. And even 6 years now after the Rana Plaza collapse, that tragedy that killed 1,100 people in April of 2013 in Bangladesh, we're still not seeing sufficient improvements in safety conditions in those garment factories, and not because the companies that came together in the alliance or the accord or the efforts of the ILO haven't been serious and persistent, but the efforts of the Bangladesh government have not been sufficient or consistent. That's just one of many examples. I'll stop with that one, but I think that we're going to have to do a better job in this field of aligning governments, and indeed that's the theme of the UN Annual Forum in Geneva next week.
Yes, exactly. I will touch also on that in my closing remarks, but there are two questions, one from Patricia, and also David Schilling would like to make a comment. David, over to you, and then I'll read out Patricia's questions.
Great, thanks so much. Again, a wonderful webinar, and we can see a lot of ways in which we can use this. Picking up on Frank's question, because there's such a difference between a narrow sort of supply chain compliance auditing and the aperture opening with a human rights impact assessment, looking at not just where workers are working, but also the communities from which they come, the recruitment, et cetera. But I wonder, Dan, just a very specific question, because we're facing in a lot of our engagements there, you know, as Frank said, it's essentially, well, we have a compliance program and we're implementing it in X number of countries, et cetera, et cetera. So where you have engaged with companies and they look at the score of the embedding of the human rights due diligence and it's a 0, do you get into the context of that, which includes kind of that narrow mentality of, you know, supply chain compliance? And is there any kind of, do you think, any movement where you are talking to companies that, you know, why did we get this low score? Look, we have this code. Any thoughts about that, or are there examples where you see some movement?
I mean, one of the things we kind of see is that people say, here's our overarching code, and here is some examples of where we've done something that we think is really good. And normally when they've done something really good, it's because there's been a human rights abuse and they've had to do something. But what we don't see, apart from some of the more leading companies, is public disclosure about how they do things, how they implement their stuff holistically across their organization. So even some of the kind of middle companies will be doing an impact assessment, but they'll be doing an impact assessment in one kind of discrete topic, one little tiny part of their supply chain. What they won't be doing is explaining how they look as a company at their human rights risks and impacts and how they prioritize and work on those. They just focus straight into, here's a great example, because that's something we can slap a picture on and stick it in a sustainability report. So I think there's definitely gradations between those. And I think it's coming back and going, don't be bamboozled by a good example, because the good example is the one that bucks the trend. It's not what they're doing consistently across their company.
Right, exactly.
Thank you, David.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much. Okay. I think this is going to be the last question for today. So Patricia is, first off, very thankful for the great data that's being shared and the deep analysis. So I think, you know, going to that appreciation, she's really wondering, you know, how many people you have conducting this research, you know, and how do you think the number of companies can be expanded to a variety of asset classes to be more useful to investors, and specifically, how can new or improved technology assist in this process?
Sure. So it's quite high on the mind, actually, particularly with the review next year. But to put it into context, we might spend 4-5 days, depending on the company, looking at a limited scope of human rights. Someone like Visio Iris might spend 4 days looking at ESG, and someone like Sustainalytics, MSCI, may spend 1 day, for instance, looking at ESG across the whole. So the number of companies that we can look at is always going to be dictated by the depth that we go into. And what we're looking to do is identify more of those more powerful indicators and how we can condense it down. We're working with the World Benchmarking Alliance to kind of have a cut down number of indicators to apply out to 2,000 companies. And there'll be a core of human rights in that element. but it's still not going to be necessarily the 20,000 universe that investors would like to have at their fingertips for that. So we've had people come to us and say, we can do some AI solutions. And I'm like, great, show me it works for one indicator and we'll have another conversation. But to be honest, a 60, a 70, an 80, even a 90% kind of accuracy is not good enough. We need to be like 99.9% or we'll get ripped apart by the companies. Because in the appeals process, Exxon General Counsel is on there saying they need 0.5% more than they've got because this is what Shell said. So we have maybe, at peak times, like a dozen researchers working full time, and that's for a couple months at a time. So it does take a lot of work that goes with it. But we do want to expand out to 2,000 companies on a reduced number of indicators, which ties me onto something we didn't speak about, but other people have been using a cut down version of our methodology for national level snapshots to say, okay, in Germany, in Finland, in Ireland, this is how we're doing on UNGP implementation. And they've all come up with the same kind of answer, which is the UNGPs are not being implemented by the companies. And this ties into the call for mandatory human rights due diligence. So I just wanted to loop that back round to the other work that I know the Investor Alliance is doing.
Great. Okay, Bennett, I think that we're going to wrap up. So if you have any last words, please, you have about a minute.
Yeah, my final word is really to urge investors aligned with the Investor Alliance for Human Rights, which has been such a positive, important new initiative in the field, but others who to use this data, use it for those two purposes, use it to inform your investment research, your due diligence, use it to inform your engagement and your shareholder advocacy. I can tell you from my perspective of having run the Calvert SRI and ESG research platform for 9 years, that had we had this wealth of data, and it's not just CHRB, it's what Know the Chain and Ranking Digital Rights are doing in parallel as well, it would have greatly enriched and enlarged our analytical understanding of our investable universe of companies. So, I really do hope that this data can be used, and I would urge it to be used as quickly, as soon as possible, while it remains hot, fresh, right out of the oven, just 72 hours ago.
Great. That's an excellent way to end, because I really wanted to wrap up by sharing a little bit with our members on the line, what our plans are moving forward. So first off, to say that absolutely, we are now in sort of collaboration, coordination with the CHRB team, working together to sort of draft a letter that we could then share with members in the next couple of weeks to then identify companies that we will sort of be reaching out to, really based on the results, and encourage them to really improve in line with the findings. So that's something that's coming down the sort of the pipeline to look out for. And another key initiative that right now is sort of time sensitive is our statement that we currently have out for sign-on, which is the deadline for sign-on for the statement on mandatory due diligence is this Wednesday. And I think it's important, it's been touched on during the conversation. I think clearly there are significant gaps in terms of companies really implementing the UN guiding principles, and certainly concerning in the figures in the tech sector. And so really this statement is our effort to, as a way to help investors really fulfill their own human rights responsibilities, they need companies to do the same. And, the findings of the CHRB are certainly a concern. And therefore, we're really trying to put together our leverage as investors and really bring the investor voice to governments to make sure that governments are actually regulating, mandating human rights due diligence by companies. So there are another 2 days for members to sign on to that statement. We will be launching it at the UN Annual Forum on Business and Human Rights, and then next week already, which is, again, as Bennett mentioned, focused on what is the state role in ensuring that companies respect human rights. So I think a very timely moment. So those are the two big activities coming up down the pipeline in relation to the topics discussed today. We will be in touch over the listserv and email to discuss further. Following this, we'll also share the webinar. You'll have the slides as well. And of course, please do reach out with any questions or comments to myself and also the CHRB team, who are key allies in these engagements moving forward. So with that, thank you all for joining us today and looking forward to being in touch. Bennett, did you have something to add?
There's one last activity. December 10th, Human Rights Day. We are doing a U.S. event focused on investors. There will be companies, but focused primarily on investors, hosted by BlackRock at 9 o'clock Eastern Time in New York City, Tuesday, December 10, Human Rights Day. We are very excited to have panels put together, both of investors and of companies, as well as a keynoter. I can say today that our keynote speaker will be former UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Prince Said. So it's going to be a useful and interesting couple of hours, and we really urge those of you who are based in New York City or, you know, a train ride away in Boston or Washington or in between to join us. And Dan, I don't know if we're going to have a webcast capability as well, but it's going to, we hope, be a significant event.
Great. Well, we'll share the details, sort of a formal invitation, registration after via email as well. So that's a great reminder, Bennett. Thanks for that. Okay, we're a minute past the hour. Thanks again, everyone, for joining. Looking forward to being in touch soon with next steps. And thank you, Dan and Bennett as well.
Thanks very much. Cheers.
Thanks, everybody. Cheers.